Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal, brought to you by the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host for the podcast. Each week we explore Philadelphia's rich baseball history with a special guest. He may be a former major or minor league player, a baseball historian, beat writer, or some other personality associated with the city's rich baseball past. This week I'm pleased to have as my guest Bill Jenkinson, Major League Baseball's home run historian and a consultant to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Bill is author of The Year Babe Ruth Hit 104 Home Runs and Baseball's Ultimate Power, ranking the all-time greatest distance home run hitters. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Well, thank you, Bill, for having me. I'm pleased to be with you.
Bill, growing up in the Philadelphia area, you were a regular Scheid Park or Connie Mack Stadium fan, and you followed the trials and the tribulations of both the Phillies and the Athletics. Was there a particular power hitter from either of those teams who inspired your fascination with the home run?
Bill, there's one guy who stands out above everyone else, and that is Dick Allen. But I would like to answer your question, if I may, in somewhat of a chronological order, because there are others as well. Mm-hmm. But I will repeat, the primary answer is Dick Allen. He came to the Phillies in 1964 when I was 17, and there hadn't been much to cheer about for several years. And when I saw the way he played the game and how prodigiously far he hit a baseball, I was mesmerized. Mm-hmm. But going back, I should say that my dad took me to a Phillies Athletics exhibition game in 1953. And our tickets just happened to be along the third baseline in, say, mid-left field. So both Gus Zernial for the A's and Del Ennis for the Phillies would take their defensive positions right in front of me. And my dad explained that they were two great power-hitting ball players, and it just grabbed me. The idea that I was watching these powerful guys, even as a 6-year-old kid, just went right into my imagination, and I asked him who was the strongest hitter of the two. And he told me honestly that he didn't know, but he was not only a good authority on sports, he was a good father, and he patiently explained all the long ball hitting glories that he had seen, including Jimmy Fox and Babe Ruth, and I was hooked right then as a 6-year-old on the matter of great power and distance hitting. And
now, Bill, I know you must have met both Zernial and Ennis later on, and probably even interviewed them. Did you ever ask them about their power hitting prowess and share those early memories with them?
I had the chance with Del Ennis, unfortunately not with Gus. Until, much later, and it was just a brief coast-to-coast phone call. Mm-hmm. But with Del, living in the Philadelphia area, and of course operating that bowling alley for all those years, I was able to sit down with him on several occasions and talk about it. And yes, I did tell Gus about it. Del about that night, and he got a big kick out of it. And your listeners, Bill, might enjoy the story that according to both Richie Ashburn and Del Ennis, the longest drive he ever hit was in Graterford Prison.
No kidding.
No. It was actually Ashburn who told me about it, and I double-checked with Del, and he confirmed it. So with a little research, I looked up the date, and I called the prison. I found out the guy who pitched the ball was still an inmate there. He was a so-called lifer because of first-degree murder of all things.
So was this an exhibition game that the Phillies just went down and played the inmates at Graterford?
Yeah, big league teams occasionally did that. There have been a lot of teams that played in Sing Sing up along the Hudson in New York.
That's wild.
Yeah, it is. So I actually asked for an interview, and it was granted by the warden. I drove up there. I must admit it was a little disconcerting to hear those gates locked behind me.
Mm-hmm.
But I met the guy who pitched the ball. By then he had aged and mellowed out and seemed like a really fine fella. And we walked out to the prison yard, and he showed me where Dell hit that home run. It was quite a story.
Wow. Now there must be something about the home run itself. I mean, I've always looked at the home run as the true measure of a hitter's brilliance. But a lot of people, they just look at it and wow, big hit. What is it about the home run itself that really captured your imagination?
Well, I find, Bill, that just about everyone is fascinated with power, and not necessarily in how far a guy or a gal can hit a baseball, but just in the application of power itself, military power, political, financial power, one form or another. Just about everyone is fascinated with that, and I am too, in all its forms. In my particular case, I found the application of athletic power to be particularly appealing. Guys who could run faster and harder than anyone else. Wilt Chamberlain was a personal favorite athlete of mine, and I followed his whole career. And you go down there to the old convention hall, you're lucky enough to get a seat nearby, and that guy would slam dunk, and you could feel it. You could feel it sitting 30 or 40 feet away. I mean, the vibrations would go right through the ground-based basket, and you could feel the vibrations. And you could hear the guys grunting, trying to stop him, and then he would just push him aside, and it was magnificent. And I just love that sort of stuff, and it just has carried over into baseball.
Now, when I started my baseball writing career back in the 90s, yours was the name that kept on popping up. So I just, home run historian and Bill Jenkinson were synonymous for me. But, you had told me, after we met and we started comparing notes, that in the 1950s, John Tattersall began researching every major league home run beginning in the early 19th century and continued until his death in 81. And then after he passed, Bob McConnell and Dave Vincent of SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research, continued to practice. So you really are part of a line of home run historians. Did you ever have a chance to meet Tattersall and compare notes with him, or?
No, I didn't get the chance to meet John, but by my great good fortune, keeping in mind, Bill, that all these logs were not digitalized back when I started in 1979. Right. They were just on hard copies, and they had been inherited by Bob McConnell, who's a great gentleman, and he resided, fortunately for me, in the suburbs of Wilmington, Delaware. And I made a practice for, my goodness, well over a decade of commuting back and forth between my home in Willow Grove and Bob's basement. And I would just sit there and hour after hour after hour laboriously copy the home run logs from the Tattersall records. And now today you don't have to do that because eventually all those Tattersall records were, along with Dave Vincent's help, who succeeded Bob McConnell with this project, they're all digitalized. You can go on to baseballreference.com, and every home run that's ever been hit is right there for you to look up. Now, what I did, of course, was start researching where they went and how far they went. Right. And I think the listeners should know that there's not anything that I can do to add to the work of Tattersall, McConnell, and Vincent. That job was already done by guys who preceded me. What I've done is taken over on the subject of the tape measure home runs. Right. And that is my real field of expertise.
Yeah, I don't think, listeners understand just what's involved in your research. I mean, What you do is unbelievable. I mean, when you research a home run, you also look at newspaper accounts of them. You compare them. It's not just a matter of, and in some cases going and measuring them, but it's not just a matter of recording when the home run was hit, who the home run was hit off of, and how far it went. I mean, there's a lot of research, a lot of travel, and a lot of time that is put into this. What is your process when you decide to either work on a specific power hitter and their tape measure home runs, or just, let's say, a tape measure home run itself?
Well, there's not a lot that I have to do now, of course, because everything is available on video. You just go to Hit Tracker, StatCast. You just turn on your computer and you can see them for yourself. Mm-hmm. But what happened, and I guess I should just fill in the blanks just a teeny bit because I never answered your first question fully. I think I owe it to the family of Stan Lepata, the old Phillies catcher from the 1950s, to mention him. Bill, he was a prodigiously strong man, not someone who is of such star caliber that most people remember him, but I was fascinated with Stan in the mid-50s when he had those two back-to-back highly productive seasons. Mm-hmm. And so I think he should be mentioned. And, of course, after Dick Allen, those of us who followed the Phillies, we had the pleasure of seeing Mud Schmidt and Greg Luzinski play, two great home run hitters as well. And as you know, I am also a big fan of Rocky Colavito. Mm-hmm. And that's a separate story, but I should mention him simply because even though he played in Cleveland at the time, I somehow developed a fascination for him as well. But anyway, getting back to the chronology, I was so interested in who was the longest hitter ever, mostly because of Dick Allen, that in the late 70s I started making inquiries about obtaining a book on the subject, and I found out that there was no book. Mm-hmm. And initially, Bill, I didn't think that I would be the one to make a lifetime study of the topic, but that void did induce me to travel down to the Philadelphia Public Library and look up some of Allen's home runs, and I got hooked. Now, that was 1979, and I found back then I had to get the actual home run dates and places from Bob McConnell, based on the Tattersall records, but in order to find out where the balls landed, I had to look them up in newspapers on old microfilm reels. Mm-hmm. And starting when I did, the only way you could do that was to go to a library and do it. So it was, in fact, a very laborious process. Now, if I started that now, in 2017, not so much so, because probably two-thirds of the papers that I accessed then are digitalized now, and by paying modest costs and getting subscriptions to different services, you can pull them up on your own computer right inside your house.
Mm-hmm. Of all baseball's power hitters, and we're going to get back to Allen and Schmidt and Luzinski and those folks, but of all baseball's power hitters, Babe Ruth stands alone. His single season and career records might have been broken, but no one in baseball's history or even in American sports history can compare with his influence, and I think his power, is safe to say. In your book, The Year Babe Ruth Hit 104 Home Runs, you argue that Ruth, if he had played in modern ballparks under modern rules, would have hit 104 home runs in 1921. You also contend in that book that he would have hit 90 homers in some other seasons and over 60 homers many times in his career. That means, if I'm correct in those numbers, that means he would have hit well over 1,000 home runs during his career. How did you come to those conclusions?
Well, the methodology is the same that I just described to you, getting the facts off newspaper microfilm accounts. But the application of the data, once I had it, was pretty simplistic. All I did was to take a grid representing a then typical major league ballpark. It's actually shrunk since then, and he probably add a few more to the 104. Because when I first started doing this, back in the 1990s to get a real feel for what Ruth had accomplished, I used 330-foot foul lines, 375-foot power alleys, and a 405-foot distance to dead center field, and then use a standard 8-foot fence. So, keeping in mind that we had a very elaborate and sophisticated newspaper system when Ruth was playing, people should know that. When Ruth was playing for the Yankees, back in the 20s, there were as many as 15 daily newspapers covering what he did. By the time he finished, radio was in its infancy, and that number was down to about 8. But when you add the minimum of 5 daily newspapers to all the other major league cities, you're talking about anywhere from 13 to 20 accounts of every home run that Babe Ruth ever hit. And they're still available. You just have to dig them out, okay? So I started doing this research, and I had a pretty good idea, sometimes not exact, but a pretty good idea, generally within about 10 feet or so, of where all of Babe Ruth's home runs landed. And since, of course, back then we also had this tendency in Major League Baseball to set the center field fences at prodigious distances, a minimum of 450 feet in the American League, out to 490 feet at Yankee Stadium during Ruth's career. You also had to factor in lots of doubles, triples, and long flyouts. So in his peak season, not his most famous season, which was 1927 when he hit the 60, but in what I regard as his peak season in 1921, I simply plotted all of his long batted balls onto that grid representing a modern stadium. And when you just add the slight variation of 8 extra games from 154 to 162 games, which added just 2 more home runs, you come up with a very realistic total of 104 home runs. Now, that reasonably can't be argued, Bill. What could be argued, and I accept this, is that if anyone, including Babe Ruth, were hitting home runs with that kind of frequency, they might have walked them even more than they did. We saw that with Barry Bonds in the early 2000s when he started hitting home runs at a record pace. Pitchers just shied away from him and started walking him in record numbers. Now, Ruth also walked in record totals, but I believe it's fair to say that if he were hitting at a pace of 100 home runs instead of 50 or 60, they probably would have walked him a little bit more, and maybe that total would have gone down. But if we use only what he actually did in 1921, and we apply it to modern standards, you get 104 home runs.
Now, describe for me a Babe Ruth home run. Artillery fire, long, high, fly ball. What was a Ruth home run like?
Well, I wish that all of us, including myself, could have seen them, because they were an extraordinary sensual experience. I can't possibly convey in the time that we have how the sight of a Ruthian home run moved people back in real time. There were, of course, reference frames of just what a human being supposedly was capable of doing, and Ruth routinely just shattered those reference frames. I've read literally thousands and thousands of accounts of his batted balls, and I think an accurate word to describe those reactions would be that they were stupefied. And as you know, Bill, he did have an uppercut swing, so generally his drives were hit very high into the sky, and sometimes outfielders reported getting vertigo and trying to follow them, and catch them. But there were times when he leveled off and he would hit line drives, and it's hard to believe that this could have actually happened, but it's confirmed that in Yankee Stadium, July 20th, 1924, against the Cleveland Indians, he hit a line drive that actually brushed past the ear of the Cleveland Indians pitcher,
Mm-hmm.
it still went 50 feet over the center fielder's head, landed beyond the running track, bounced against the fence 490 feet away, and ricocheted back towards the playing field, back across the running track.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've shown this data to some physicists, and let's use the word again. These are men of science. Stupefied would be the only word that I could use to describe their reaction to a human being hitting a ball that hard.
You know, it's amazing you gave that particular example because Dick Allen, when he was with the Chicago White Sox, hit a very similar line drive past the ear of Mickey Lolich in a game against the Tigers, and the ball just kept on rising. It ended up in the center field stands, and Lolich was still sitting on the mound, and Martin runs out to him and says, what's wrong? Did you get hit? And Lolich said, I just sat down here because I was afraid that the damn ball was going to ricochet off the fence, come back and kill me. You know, so those were the kinds of home runs that Dick Allen hit. They took off his line drives, and they just kept on rising. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence that Judy Johnson, the great Negro League third baseman who's in the Hall of Fame, later in his career scouted for the Phillies. And this is a guy who played against Ruth in barnstorming exhibitions, and he also saw the beginnings of Richie Allen's career. And he said that he only heard a ball jump off a bat one other time like it did off of Allen's bat, and he said it was off Ruth's bat. So I would love to know if it's even possible to determine what the exit speed was off of Ruth's bat.
Yeah, obviously we're never going to know, Bill, but I would bet the last dollar that I have that it would be in excess of anyone playing today.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, I'm up here in northeastern Pennsylvania during the work week, and like many baseball fans, I've always been fascinated with Ruth. So I was just tickled when I found out, thanks to you, that Ruth himself believed that he hit his longest home run at Wilkes-Barre's Artillery Park in an October 12, 1926 exhibition game between Hughestown and Larksville. I guess Ruth was playing for Larksville in that game. And that shot is said to have traveled some 650 feet from home plate. And that, Mark, thanks to you, is now memorialized with a triptych marker. Tell us about that home run, Bill.
Bill, there's so much to say, and yet I feel conflicted because having done all this research and, of course, having the common sense to ask for help with the people with the appropriate scientific backgrounds, I have these strong doubts that any human being can hit a ball 600 feet, including Babe Ruth. And yet, in this one case, the one that you're mentioning, the data points in that direction. Babe was up there on one of his annual barnstorming tours, and the game was relatively uneventful. And after 6 innings, the people only wanted to see Babe Ruth hit a home run. Up to that point, he had been 0 for 2. Mm-hmm. And he knew what was going on. This was common fare for Ruth. He knew why the people had come out. So he challenged Ernie Corcoran from Pittston to try to get him out, try to use his best fastball against him. So spontaneously, the game was called off, and Corcoran and 3 other local pitchers, 4 of them altogether, started taking turns in trying to best Babe Ruth.
No kidding. I did not know that the game was called off. I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, just suspended, and it's not the only time that happened with Ruth. It always depended on the circumstances, of course. If you were playing another major league team where those guys had their own egos, perhaps they'd be less likely to do it. Mm-hmm. But this is a game between, as you said, Hughestown and Larksville, 2 local teams, and the fans had already had their fill of a standard 6-inning ball game. Mm-hmm. They wanted Ruth. So I think it's important to mention that this was not batting practice. I mean, this was still highly competitive. Mm-hmm. I've read all the accounts, and these guys were doing their absolute best, and you're talking about curveballs and mixed with fastballs, everything that a pitcher would normally do. And Ruth had only hit one home run that way and hit one out to left field, and that's when the magic happened. Corcoran, after throwing a few breaking balls, tried to slip a fastball by him, and Ruth just absolutely unloaded. And according to Dave himself, he felt that he had never hit a ball harder or more cleanly. And it was a rising line drive, and it went out like a golf ball over the fence in deep right center field, which was, I measured it, which was just a little over 400 feet away where it passed, and it landed on the other side of a running track on an adjoining playing field. Mm-hmm. And you get all these crazy, seemingly crazy estimates. The 650 feet, 600 feet. The Scranton Republican even estimated 700 feet. And I believe none of them. It just didn't seem humanly possible, and it still may not be. But here's the thing. I was able to identify a couple eyewitnesses. The primary one was a fellow by the name of Joe Gibbons, who, as of 2003, when I interacted with him, was 87 years old. But he's still completely lucid, a really sober guy, had served in World War II, served in the post office, raised a family, and he still seemed to be sharp as a whip. And I met him. We went out to the field, and he told his story. And then I asked him if he could show me where the ball landed. And Bill, he was sitting with his father and his uncle in the stands about halfway up on the first base side, so he had a perfect view of the flight of the ball. And this guy walked out there in 2003 and stood on the spot, pointed at the ground, and said, "This is where it landed." Now, he's a single human being. He's capable of error. But I found it fascinating that when I then measured it, it was 650 feet.
Wow. Now, Bill, you said that Ruth felt it was the hardest ball he ever hit. Did Ruth have it measured at the time he hit it?
Well, that's the frustrating part of the story, Bill, because Ruth actually, and I don't know of any other time in his entire career when he made this kind of request, he actually asked the local officials to measure it. He said, I'm looking at some of the quotes right in front of me right now from the Sporting News and other sources, and he declared that it was the best he'd ever hit a ball. Somebody asked him, well, how does this compare to the 500-footer you hit just last week in St. Louis in the World Series? And he said, I hit this one a lot farther. That's a direct quote. Yeah.
Wow.
But here's the problem with all this, and for me it's been very disillusioning. Considering this is Babe Ruth and that he made this request, you would think that almost certainly these guys would have acted on it. But despite reading and rereading every single paper in northeastern Pennsylvania, I have found no follow-up whatsoever. They were starting to turn the field into they're getting it ready for a college football game the next weekend.
Right.
And maybe they just lost track of Babe's request. I think there's a good chance that it was measured the next morning as promised to him. But if so, it was never reported in the papers, and we just don't have the number.
Mm-hmm. For listeners, that Artillery Park was later the home ball field of the Wilkes-Barre Barons, who were an Eastern League team up here in the 1930s and 40s. And today, that field is still playable. It is the home baseball park of Wilkes University, and the Colonels play on that field. And it really is a very nice park. I want to move on to your more recent book, Baseball's Ultimate Power, where you give us a history of the tape measure home run. But before I do that, I want to ask, what makes a great home run hitter?
Well, as you know, Bill, there's no quick answer to that. It's a complicated combination of various physical and mental attributes. You start, of course, needing to have the musculature, I guess to use the common phrase that I guess was initiated by kinesiologists of so-called fast twitch muscle fiber. And you have to be able to whip a 34-ounce piece of carved wood at a high rate of speed. Now, you get some other athletes, let's just say like a typical NFL lineman, a 330-pound lineman. Well, he's your guy. If you want to move a refrigerator or bench press, several hundred pounds, whatever it is. And I'm not saying that none of those guys could swing a baseball bat, but most of them really can't, And it's a different athletic function. So this particular power is focused solely on a human being being able to take a carved piece of wood, generally about 34 ounces, and whipping it at high rates of speed. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes the guys or gals, because I have to say gals because my daughter was known for being a good power hitter in her own right. Mm-hmm. They're usually bigger than average in size, but not necessarily so. And, of course, then you need the neurology. You have to have good eyesight. You have to have coordination. You have to have very fast reflexes to compete against Major League pitching. And lastly, and I guess all of our listeners probably know this, you have to have the athletic intelligence of being able to work a count so that you swing at hittable pitches. Some guys just can't ever master that, and within a few years they're out of the big leagues. So you get a guy like Ruth, who was athletically brilliant, a guy like Ted Williams, who was famous for it. And in order to be a great home run hitter, you have to be able to find a way to swing at good pitches.
Bill, aren't you born with those qualities, though? Like, you cannot make a great home run hitter. No matter how hard you try, you can't build a home run hitter, right? You got to be born with those qualities.
Yes, of course you do, Bill. You're right. There's nothing you can do if you don't have those innate abilities. Of course, you can work at your craft so that you reach your full potential, but if you ain't got it, it's never going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to get to Baseball's Ultimate Power, and listeners, this is a phenomenal book. Bill ranks the top 40 home run hitters historically, with Ruth being at number 1. Among the others on that list are sluggers from the old Philadelphia Athletics, namely Jimmy Fox. He's ranked number 2. And Phillies, including Dick Allen, who's number 5, Greg Luzinski, number 11, and Mike Schmidt, number 34. And interesting, Lou Gehrig, who's usually considered right up there with Ruth, is number 22. So we've got 3 Phillies hitters, Philadelphia sluggers, Fox, Allen, and Luzinski, who rank well above Lou Gehrig. Bill, how did you arrive at these rankings?
Well, first of all, Bill, there is no formal way of measuring. I went about the business of doing the same research with all these guys that I did with Ruth. Mm-hmm. Trying to get accounts of every one of their career home runs. And then what I was looking for is a pattern of great distance. I used 3 criteria. I was looking at, number 1, their top 10 longest. I try not to use just a single longest because there could be some luck involved. The guy may have had the advantage of hitting a single drive with a 25-mile-an-hour wind behind him. So I like to look at their top 10 longest drives, and I would suggest that their 10th longest drive is probably more meaningful than their single longest drive. Mm-hmm. And then I look for an overall pattern of drives of like a 450 feet or more, 450 feet being my definition of a true tape measure home run. Mm-hmm. Then the third criteria, the tiebreaker in every case, was just how many career home runs did they hit.
Right.
So, again, I'm talking about optimum power here. And I would dearly love for modern fans to discover Jimmy Fox. That man was a true athletic marvel. He could do anything and everything on the baseball field. The guy was blazingly fast as a sprinter. He was the state champion in the 200-meter sprint in high school in Maryland.
Wow.
And retained that running speed well into his 30s, even after he had done some catching. And he had some issues. He was beamed in Canada and the outset of the American League All-Stars heading across the Pacific Ocean to have a series of games in Japan. Well, working his way across Canada before they departed from Seattle, Fox was beamed, and it really was a crippling event in his life. And most people don't understand that when Jimmy turned to alcohol a few years later, it wasn't because he was a weak character. He was trying to dull the pain of a permanently disabling injury. He reached 500 home runs faster than anyone else. And so this guy is a tremendous hitter, tremendous all-around baseball player, and I'm convinced that he deserves the number 2 ranking for distance. Now,
what about Dick Allen? This is a favorite of yours, and you've charted every single one of his home runs.
Yeah, Allen is a favorite of mine, a personal favorite. I think people need to hear that if they want to question my objectivity. But I think the data speaks for itself. He left a trail of truly prodigious home runs from start to finish. I saw some of them. I saw him hit a walk-off home run against Bob Friend, who was pitching for the Mets late in his career, that zoomed over the old Cadillac sign up around light level on that light tower. It went out so fast, Bill, that people, including myself, literally had a hard time following it. It's just hard for me to imagine that anyone could do that, and it's even hard to think about how far away that ball landed, at, well over 500 feet. There can't be any question about it. I saw it. I watched it. So this guy is just he's brilliant as a long distance hitter.
And
fairness to Greg Luzinski.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
When I start looking at all the data, I'm trying to rank these guys. Ruth stands alone. But then, and this I guess this shouldn't be a surprise, there's like a mini group of 2, 3, 4, and 5, Fox, Mantle, Frank Howard, and Dick Allen, who I felt sort of surpassed everybody else, but it's close. And you get a guy like Mark McGwire, who in the second half of his career probably deserves to be with those other 4. But come on, I mean, let's be honest here. Mark has admitted to using steroids, and in the first,
we're going to get to that one. We're going to get to that one.
Yeah, and he was not a tape measure home run hitter for the first half of his career. He simply wasn't. So we could rank him to what he did in the second half of his career, but there it is. You got to factor that in. And then you get another group: Harmon Killebrew, Reggie Jackson, Ted Williams. And Greg Luzinski is with that, and Willie Stargell, Willie McCovey. And Greg is in that group. Just a very, very, very slight drop-off from the Allen group. And of course, in Greg's case, tremendously powerful human being. He hit just over 300 home runs. And so if there's a tiebreaker, I guess you got to go with, say, a guy like Killebrew or Williams who hit over 500.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a newfound, after reading the book and seeing where you rank Luzinski, I have a newfound respect for the Bull. I was very fascinated with your remark about Mike Schmidt, and hopefully I can get this right. He was not really your prototypical home run hitter. Is that what you really said about him? He wasn't really built to hit the home run?
Well, Mike Schmidt is just an extraordinary all-around athlete. He can do everything. And the fact that he hit, what was it, Bill, 548 home runs?
548.
I mean, that's incredible. And here's a guy that won Gold Gloves year after year. He was a tremendous base runner. He was an athletic prodigy. He could do everything. And he had a controlled swing. And, ranking 34 is pretty good when you compare it to, 10,000 guys. I make no apology for that. In fact, I would argue that for a guy to play all-around baseball like Mike Schmidt did and still rank that high, it's just a pure distance hitter. It's pretty extraordinary.
So what you're saying is
Mike
also
asked me to comment on Lou Gehrig, and
right.
Lou, I should say, would rank higher if his swing was slightly different. Lou Gehrig had a very level swing, Bill. So when he hit a ball with optimum power, it would generally take off at maybe 18 or 19 degrees of elevation. And we know from our physicist friends that in order to achieve maximum distance, you got to hit it about 26 or 27 degrees. Gehrig was as strong as anybody else, but his swing didn't allow him to reach the same distances that most of those other guys did.
Back to Schmidt for a second. It seems to me what you're saying is that Mike Schmidt was a five-tool player. He could run, he could hit for power, he could field, he could throw. Most of these home run hitters, aren't they maybe two max three-dimensional players, three-tool players?
Yeah, there's a rare few who could do everything. Your Fox and your Mantle and Ruth, of course. But most of the guys, Frank Howard would be included in that, and say Willie McCovey, Willie Stargell, Harmon Killebrew, they were not five-tool players, so I think that's fair, yes.
Okay. I want to get to this issue about steroids. We've already talked a little bit about McGuire. Of course, Bonds is in that conversation, too. There are many historians who believe that the steroids era has had a tremendously negative effect on the integrity of the game, specifically in terms of destroying the records of power hitters who did not enjoy the same advantage. What, in your estimation, has been the impact of steroids on power hitting?
Pretty much just what you said, Bill. I'm disgusted by it. Now, I get the fact that I'm a historian and the average fan isn't going to care as much about the past as I do. I can acknowledge and accept that, but I don't have to like it. And it riles me to see Barry Bonds' name ahead of Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth. I'm offended by it emotionally and intellectually. Now, in fairness to Bonds, he was a tremendous player before he started taking steroids. He was a legitimate Hall of Fame player. Mm-hmm. But there's no way that he would have hit over 700 home runs if he hadn't started taking steroids. And we can say that. It's in his court testimony. I've heard some people try to defend him by saying that it was never proven. Well, that's just not true. Mm-hmm. The official court records have Barry Bonds acknowledging that he took steroids. Now, he said he did it accidentally, but he admits that he did it. Mm-hmm. So I just don't take his record seriously. I'm sorry, I don't. And I feel the same way about everyone else who used steroids, and I have a problem with it. I'm a traditionalist, and I'm pleased that the game has been mostly cleaned up. We have no guarantees that the current crop of sluggers aren't using something illegal. But I think we don't have anyone. Let's put it this way, Bill. We don't have anyone that started out as a 180-pound athlete as a rookie and then turned into a 230-pound giant. We haven't seen any of that with the current group of guys. Mm-hmm. So you see, 6'6" Giancarlo Stanton crushing the ball for prodigious distances. My belief, I can't guarantee anything to anyone, but my belief is that he's clean. Mm-hmm. And I really respect what he's doing. But that group from the so-called steroid era, I have a big problem with that.
Now, the follow-up on this, Bill, and I'm very eager to hear your response to this, where does this put the Hall of Fame in determining baseball immortality? I mean, we've got guys like Dick Allen and Rocky Colavito immediately come into mind who I believe their numbers warrant an induction. And now the Hall of Fame has got to deal with the steroids issue. we have these players like Allen and Colavito who are now thrown into veterans committees, and it seems to me the veterans committees don't even look at sabermetrics. And in those two cases in particular, sabermetrics really reinforce their Hall of Fame candidacies. So what does the Hall of Fame need to do to determine who's worthy of baseball mortality, particularly in lieu of the steroids era and those guys like Allen and Colavito who are still out there?
To answer your question, Bill, it's my opinion that they would have to do something that they're unlikely to do. They would have to disconnect from baseball as a business.
Mm-hmm.
MLB, through whatever marketing mechanisms that they use, has chosen to shine the spotlight on the modern athletes. They know that many baseball fans are connected with the past, and we use baseball as a bridge sometimes in families from generation to generation. They get that, but they, for whatever reason, and I haven't seen their studies, but I interact with them, and I have a lot of friends in the MLB office, and I consider myself a friend of MLB, and as a general rule, I think they're doing a great job. But, again, as a historian, I see things through a slightly different lens.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this bias right now, Bill, that everybody today is bigger, stronger, faster than everyone that went before. Now, that's not true. The modern athlete, the current athlete, is, on average, bigger, stronger, and faster than all the generations that went before him. But look, we've already talked about Babe Ruth's batting power. You mentioned Rocky Colavito. I mean, here's a guy who not only hit 370-some home runs, but on July 1st, 1956, in a throwing exhibition in San Diego, he threw 3 consecutive balls over the 426-foot sign in center field. One of them landed on a batting cage at least 10 feet farther away from the fence, at least. Mickey Mantle was timed at 3.1 from home to first in 1951, his rookie year. Mm-hmm. He was timed to 3.1 in the same function in 1960, his 10th professional season. Bill, we don't have anybody in MLB that comes close to that. So I would like modern fans to understand that, yes, these guys are getting bigger and stronger and faster. But for those guys who excelled in the past, they can stand with anyone who has followed after them, even in purely physical terms. We've got no one who can throw with Rocky Colavito. We've got no one who could run with Mickey Mantle. We've got no one, in my judgment today, who can hit with Dick Allen or Babe Ruth. We should honor them, and so should the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm. Well put. One more question for you, Bill. And I know a lot of people are eager to find out. What's your next project?
Well, the next project, I can't share with too many people. I was invited down to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where spring training began in 1886 in 2011. And we wound up working together with the folks down there in creating a historical baseball trail. There's plaques honoring all the great teams and all the great players that trained in Hot Springs. And we're going back one more time this forthcoming March to honor the 100th anniversary of baseball's first 500-foot home run hit by Babe Ruth in Hot Springs in 1918. We're adding 2 final plaques, one for Lefty Grove, who should be recognized here in Philadelphia, and one for Bill Dickey, who was a native Arkansan. So I'm writing a series of articles for that, and that's actually my next project. But for anyone interested in my research, I can assure everyone that I'm going to do that until I take my last breath.
Now, listeners can get your books on Amazon.com, correct?
I believe so.
Okay.
I don't think they're printing them anymore, but the last time I checked, they could still be obtained through Amazon and perhaps some other sources, yes.
Okay, good. Bill, thank you so much for your contributions to Major League Baseball. You are an asset to the game, and your work is an asset to those of us who record the history of the pastime. So I thank you so much for all your contributions, and thank you for being on the podcast with me.
Thanks for those kind words, Bill, and it was a pleasure being with you tonight.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.